Now our app is really coming together, but we're missing a chunk here. This whole middle area where we've got our album artwork has a black background, which is fine. It's been fine up until now, but it is intended to have a blurred version of our album art, and that's going to fill it with some color. It's going to make it look visually more interesting than just black, because black looks a little bit stark by itself. So now let's take a look at how the Gaussian blur works. So what we're going to want to do is double-click to get our album artwork selected within this mask, and now I'm going to use keyboard shortcut Command D to duplicate this album artwork. You'll notice on the inspector, or the layers list rather, we've now got 2 album artworks. Now this album artwork 2, that's the duplicate, I'm going to drag that down underneath the mask and get it outside of the group. If you find that that's acting a little funny, drag it down a little further. You can even drag it down all the way, as long as it's above this background art box, you can even drag it down as far as you want. It won't really matter as long as it's above the background art box, which is this big box in the middle, and as long as it's out of that group, so it's no longer affected by that mask. What we want to do now is select that big box that's in the middle. Mine's called background art, and we want to select the album artwork image. And with both of those selected, we're going to do something familiar. We're going to go to Layer, and we're going to choose Mask with Selected Shape, just like we did before. But now we're going to double-click into there, or on the Layers panel, we can expand this group we just made, get that album artwork selected, and now we're going to go over to the inspector and use Gaussian Blur, and that Gaussian Blur is going to allow us to blur out the image and to make it less of a distraction. Now you'll notice it is blurring in from the edges, so I'm going to grab this bounding box and I'm going to make our artwork bigger. I'm going to make it a little bit oversized. I'm holding Shift and Option to constrain the proportions and scale it out from the center, and I'm stretching out the artwork just so it's big enough that we don't see the fringe around the edges. We don't want that white fringe around the edges. And now we've got a splash of color. Now it's looking a little more interesting, a little bit more dimensional. And that's what the Gaussian blur is all about. But there are 2 other types of blurs that we have to choose from. For the next type of blur, I'm just going to select this image that we have in the middle here in our circle mask. I'm going to undo this because it's not going to be part of our design. But going back to Gaussian blur, there's also the option of motion blur. And motion blur is similar to Gaussian blur, except it's in a particular direction. And you can change the angle of that direction until you get a serious headache. Motion blur is great if you're trying to demonstrate that something is going to move in a user interface. You can use it on buttons. You can use it on things to demonstrate that they will move if you're trying to make a screen for an in-between state. For example, let's actually jump way ahead for a minute. I'm going to switch this back to not being turned on. I'm going to hit the little checkbox here and turn it off. I'm going to select the artboard, and I'm going to jump way ahead. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I'm going to go over to the inspector with my artboard selected, and with my artboard selected, I can click on the export button, which gives me a thumbnail of my artboard so that I can export it out of Sketch. I can also drag that into Sketch to give myself a picture. Now it's just a picture, it's a single layer. You can see on the layers list that this is just a bitmap image. And with that, I can apply that same motion blur, and using that motion blur, I could show that there's a screen where maybe this swipes off to the side. Now, I don't have an artboard, but I can easily get myself an artboard here by choosing A for artboard, and then by choosing the iPhone 6 portrait. And now when I put this on here, I can hang it off the edge, and with that motion blur and with the screen hanging off the edge, I can demonstrate that it swipes off the screen to the left. I might want to put a background in there or overlap this on top of the next screen or something like that. But that's just one idea of how you can apply this motion blur. And I know that moved kind of fast, and it's a concept that we haven't talked about yet, but feel free to watch this video again, or wait until we get to the exporting section, and when we get to the exporting section, this will make a lot more sense, because we'll go through it one step at a time. But that's just one example of how to use that motion blur. Now I'm going to delete this artboard, I'm going to delete the layers, and I'm going to zoom back into this guy. And now I'm going to show you the third, and probably, to be honest, the coolest type of blur that we have to choose from. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to create a rectangle, and in this rectangle I'm going to drag it across, and I'm going to get rid of the fill. Or actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to reduce the opacity of the fill so we can see through this box. So it's almost like a little piece of glass, right? I'm also going to get rid of the border. Now I'm going to go to Gaussian blur, and I don't want to Gaussian blur this box. What I want to do is background blur, just blurs what's behind my shape. And this does use quite a bit of system resources. It's going to slow Sketch down. It's going to slow your computer down. It's going to slow down exporting. Everything kind of comes to a screech. But it's a really cool effect, and I can still move this around, and wherever I move this, it's going to blur whatever's behind it, whether it's an image or a combination of shapes and objects. So it's a really great way to create a frosted glass effect, just like iOS 7 and iOS 8. And we can drag this up, and it's kind of like the control center at the bottom of iOS 7 and iOS 8. So that's what the background blur is all about. And then last and definitely least, when you have a shape selected, there's also something called zoom blur, and zoom blur just kind of blurs it outward from a center. And it's kind of like motion blur. It's a lot like motion blur, except instead of going in one direction, it's going in all directions out from the center. So not so useful. It's not quite so useful. What's cool is you can edit the origin. So if you don't want it blasting out from the center, you can have it blast away from a corner or something like that. But it's not going to be coming into play for our purposes, but maybe it'll come in handy for you in the future. So that's the idea. We've got several different blur options to choose from. We're going to run, for our interface, we're going to run with this Gaussian blur for our masked image behind our main image there, just so we've got some color filling that area, and that color is going to match the artwork, because it is the artwork. So that's looking pretty good.